Imagine a cold winter night on January 8, 1935. In a small two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, a young mother named Gladys Presley goes into labor. Beside her, her husband Vernon Presley nervously awaits the arrival of his children. Yes, Elvis Presley would not come into the world alone. He had a twin brother named Jesse Garon Presley. But something unexpected happens. Jesse is born first, but unfortunately stillborn. A painful silence fills the house. It was a moment of pain but also of hope. Because minutes later the second baby cries. And that strong, powerful cry belongs to Elvis Aaron Presley, a boy who, unbeknownst to anyone, was destined to change the history of music forever. Elvis's mother, Gladys, believed that her son was a true gift from God. The loss of her first baby made her grow even more attached to little Elvis, raising him with all the love and protection a mother can offer. He would not be just a son. He would be her treasure, her miracle. But Elvis's childhood would not be easy. The Presley family was extremely poor. They lived in a simple wooden house, barely big enough for a bed, a table and a few pieces of furniture. His father, Vernon, did what he could to support the family, but money was always tight. Sometimes there wasn't even enough to buy food. But if there's one thing Elvis learned early on, it was to find happiness in the little things. And one of those joys came from music. From a very young age, he would listen to his mother singing in the kitchen and the lively music that echoed from the neighborhood churches. There, between the church pews and the gospel hymns, little Elvis began to feel the music pulsing inside him. If you could go back in time and see Elvis Presley as a child, you would see a shy boy with curious eyes, always clinging to his mother, Gladys. He wasn't like the other boys in the neighborhood, who liked to play wrestling or run through the streets of Tupelo. No. Elvis loved something that filled his soul with emotion. Music. The Presley house was small and simple, but it was always filled with sounds. Gladys would sing to Elvis before he went to sleep, while the radio played gospel songs that spoke of faith and hope. The boy was enchanted by those powerful voices from the southern churches, who sang with such passion that it seemed like the walls were vibrating. There, without knowing it, he was absorbing the roots of what would later become his unique style. And it was in church that Elvis had his first great musical moment. Imagine a little boy of just 5 years old, blonde, dressed simply, but with a different sparkle in his eyes. He climbed up on the pew and suddenly began to sing along with the choir. His voice, strong and sweet at the same time, made the people around him turn to look. Something special was happening. But the moment that would change his life forever came on his 10th birthday. His parents didn't have money for expensive gifts, so they gave him a simple but precious gift, a guitar. At first, Elvis wanted a toy gun or a bicycle like any boy his age. But his mother insisted, "Son, this guitar can take you very far." And Gladys was right. Little Elvis began practicing non-stop. He watched street musicians, tried to imitate radio artists, and little by little he discovered something incredible. He didn't just like music, he felt the music inside him. At the age of 10, Elvis gave his first public performance. It was at a talent show at his school, where he sang a song called Old Shep. Imagine the scene. A skinny boy holding a guitar bigger than him, singing with emotion in front of a packed audience. He didn't win first place, but that didn't matter. Elvis felt something powerful at that moment. He wanted to sing for the rest of his life. And believe me, this was just the first of many performances to come. Who would have thought that this shy little boy from Tupelo was about to conquer the world? The move to Memphis and the musical influence. Little Elvis Presley grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, but life there was hard. The Presley family struggled with poverty and opportunities were few. Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, worked odd jobs to support the family, but he couldn't always pay the bills. His mother, Gladys, did everything she could to protect her son from the hardships of life, but he could see his parents struggle. Elvis knew that his family dreamed of something better. It was then that, in 1948, when Elvis was 13 years old, the family made one of the most important decisions of their lives: to move to Memphis, Tennessee. It was a bigger city, full of opportunities, and a place where Vernon believed he could get a better job. But for Elvis, this move would mean much more than a new home. It was the beginning of a transformation. As soon as they arrived in Memphis, the Presleys moved into a housing project called Lauderdale Courts. A simple place, but one that was already a step forward for the family. It was there that Elvis began to mix with people from different cultures, different sounds, different realities. And it was there that music really began to enter his life. Memphis was a musical melting pot. Blues was on every corner, played by black musicians who put their souls into every chord. Rhythm and blues was heard in bars and on the radio. Country music still dominated the interior of the state. And Elvis absorbed it all. He would spend hours and hours on Beale Street, where the best blues musicians played their instruments masterfully, while singing about life, pain, and love. He also began to frequent record stores, especially Poplar Tunes, where he would listen to the most popular releases. One of his greatest pastimes was going to Sam Phillips' Sun Records store and watching the musicians recording their songs. He was fascinated, as if he knew that one day it would be his turn. At school, however, Elvis was not a popular kid. He was different. He wore his hair slicked back, grew his sideburns, and dressed in a way that many found strange. Brightly colored shirts, baggy pants, a bit of a rebel but without losing his shyness. Many of his classmates made fun of him, but Elvis didn't care. He was focused on something bigger. He was preparing to change the world. The influence Memphis had on Elvis was crucial. He blended all of these musical styles into his own sound. He took the upbeat rhythm of the blues, the emotion of gospel, and the melody of country. Without knowing it, he was creating something unique. Now think about it. What if Elvis had never moved to Memphis? Would he have become the king of rock? Would he have found the sound that would change the history of music? The first recording, the birth of the dream. Now imagine Elvis Presley at 18 years old, a shy young man but full of dreams. He had already tried his hand at the stage in school talent contests and sang for friends and family whenever he could. But he wanted more. He wanted to hear his voice recorded. And that was why, in 1953, Elvis decided to enter the small studio of Sun Records, a Memphis record company run by a man named Sam Phillips. But he didn't go there looking for fame. At least not that first time. In fact, Elvis wanted to record an album to give as a gift to his mother, Gladys Presley. He nervously entered the studio and was greeted by Marion Kiesker, Sam Phillips' assistant. She asked him what style of music he sang, and Elvis's answer was straightforward. "I sing everything." That caught her attention. Who was this skinny kid with slicked back hair who spoke with such confidence? Elvis paid $4 to record 2 songs, "My Happiness" and "That's When Your Heartaches Begin." When he began to sing, his voice sounded unlike anything they had ever heard. It was soft yet strong. It was soulful yet full of energy. When the recording was finished, Marion wrote down Elvis's name and made a point of showing the tape to Sam Phillips. He listened to it and was intrigued, but still unsure what to do with this talented young man. Elvis left the studio, unaware that his life was about to change. For while nothing happened, Elvis continued his work as a truck driver and still sang when he could. But then the following year the phone rang. It was Sam Phillips asking him to come back to the studio. The producer was looking for a singer who had something special, a new and different sound, and someone had suggested Elvis. In July 1954, Elvis returned to Sun Records for a more serious recording session. He joined musicians Scotty Moore guitar and Bill Black bass, and spent the afternoon trying out some songs. But nothing seemed to work. Until Elvis, nervous and not knowing what to do, started playing his guitar and singing a song called "That's All Right" in a completely different way. He played fast with an engaging rhythm, hitting the guitar as if it were percussion. His voice vibrated, full of emotion. It was different, it was electrifying, it was the beginning of rock and roll. Sam Phillips heard it and knew right away, this was something special. He had the song recorded, and within a few days, "That's All Right" was played on a local radio station. And then, something incredible happened. As soon as the first chords were played, the radio station's phone started ringing off the hook. People wanted to know who this singer was, where he had come from, how they could hear more. It was a frenzy. And that's when the unexpected happened. People went crazy. The radio station's phone kept ringing. "Who is this singer? Play it again. Where can we hear more of him?" Elvis didn't know it, but that moment would change his life forever. He was no longer just a shy kid from Memphis. He was becoming a phenomenon. And now tell me, have you ever imagined what it's like to have your life change overnight? That's exactly what happened to Elvis. And from that moment on, nothing would be the same again. Imagine the scene. A 19-year-old, thin with shiny black hair, striking sideburns and a shy but energetic demeanor. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to take such a big turn that the world would never be the same again. Dewey Phillips realized he had something very special on his hands, so he decided to call Elvis for a live interview that very night. But there's a funny detail. When they went to look for Elvis, he was so nervous that he had gone to the movies afraid of what people would think of his music. When they finally found him and took him to the radio station, he was shaking. But as he listened to the audience's reactions, Elvis began to realize that his life would never be the same again. From that day on, he began to perform small shows in the southern United States. At first, he was nervous on stage, not knowing what to do with his hands. But then something unexpected happened. When he started to sing and move to the rhythm of the music, the girls started to scream. That's when one of Elvis's most iconic traits was born. His dance moves. Those natural gestures, full of energy, drove the audience crazy. The screams grew, the fervor grew, and suddenly the shy young man became a real hurricane on stage. Little by little, newspapers began to talk about him and his fame began to grow. People didn't know if Elvis was white or black just by listening to his voice on the radio, because his sound was influenced by blues, gospel, and country, a mix never seen before. This only increased the public's curiosity. With the success of That's All Right, other hits soon followed, such as Blue Moon of Kentucky, and Elvis began to gain space on big stages. It was at this time that he met Colonel Tom Parker, a businessman who saw in Elvis something that no one else saw: the potential to become the greatest artist in America. Little by little, the boy from Memphis was no longer just a local name and was becoming a national phenomenon. Now tell me, have you ever imagined having a moment in your life that changes everything? For Elvis, that moment came with just one song. And what happened after that was just the beginning of the legend. The explosion of rock and roll. Now imagine this. A young man in a plaid suit with an impeccable pompadour and a guitar in his hand, walking onto the stage. He takes a step forward, looks at the crowd, and as soon as he plays the first chord, the audience explodes in hysterical screams. That was Elvis Presley in 1955 and 1956. A true whirlwind about to take over the world. After the success of That's All Right, Elvis began touring the southern United States, performing in small towns, bars, and dance halls. But something was different. People were coming to the shows because of him. Each performance was more packed than the last, and the fans simply couldn't sit still. The screams, which started out timid, became deafening. Girls fainted, boys tried to imitate him, and adults didn't know what to think of this kid who sang like no one else, danced like no one else, and stirred everyone's emotions. But do you know what really made Elvis explode? Television. It was on the Louisiana Hayride, a famous radio and TV show, that Elvis began to gain national recognition. But it was when he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 that everything changed. Millions of people were watching at home. As soon as the camera focused on Elvis, he smiled, grabbed the microphone, and began to sing. And then came the moment that shocked America. As Elvis sang, his body began to move spontaneously, naturally. But it was when he moved his hips in a provocative way that things really got crazy. The audience, especially the girls, went into a frenzy. They screamed, jumped, cried, and the parents watching at home were horrified. The press soon began calling Elvis dangerous and a bad example for the youth. Many conservatives said his movements were indecent, that he was corrupting the youth. But guess what happened? This only made his success even greater. While some networks tried to censor him, fans wanted more and more of Elvis. His records began to sell millions, and in 1956 he released one of the biggest hits of his career, Heartbreak Hotel. The song was a phenomenon. It was played on every radio station. Each show he did had more people than the last. He was no longer just a singer, he was an icon, a symbol of a generation that wanted something new. And then came the defining moment, the contract with RCA Records. Elvis left Sun Records and signed with RCA, one of the biggest record companies in the world. With that, his success went from being just regional to exploding throughout the United States and, in a short time, all over the world. Now think about it. A shy young man who just a few years ago worked as a truck driver was now dominating the stage and driving crowds wild. Elvis was no longer just a singer. He had just created something new. He had started rock and roll as we know it today. Elvis was not like the traditional singers of the time. He didn't stand still on stage, he didn't sing in a formal, prim manner like Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby. He felt the music. His body moved to the beat, his legs moved, and his hips, Well, they moved in a way that left the audience in shock. When Elvis began performing on TV shows such as the famous The Milton Berle Show, he showed an even bolder performance. Singing Hound Dog, he couldn't hold back his energy. He danced, smiled, and did his legendary twerk. The result? The audience went wild, but the conservatives panicked. The newspapers began to attack him. They said that his dancing was vulgar, that he was corrupting the youth, and that he was a bad example for teenagers. But do you know what this had? The opposite effect. The more they spoke badly of Elvis, the more the young people loved him. He became a true symbol of rebellion. His fans began to dress like him. Leather jackets, slicked back hair, long sideburns. They wanted to imitate the style of the King of Rock. The girls fainted at his shows, and the boys wanted to have the same charm and attitude. But the controversy reached its peak when Elvis was invited to perform again on The Ed Sullivan Show, one of the most watched programs in the United States. This time, to avoid further scandals, the production decided to film him only from the waist up. Yes, they censored his famous hip movements. What happened next? The whole country wanted to know what they were trying so hard to hide. And so, without realizing it, the critics helped turn Elvis into an even bigger phenomenon. He was not just a singer, he was a symbol of change, of freedom, of something new and electrifying. While parents tried to keep their children away from Elvis's music, their children rushed to buy his records and packed the theaters to watch his movies. Rock and roll was already in the blood of the youth, and the king had just taken his throne. Now tell me something. Who would have thought that a simple dance move could change culture forever? But that's exactly what Elvis did. And believe me, he was just getting started. His career in film. Now imagine this. Elvis Presley was not only the king of rock, but he was also about to conquer the big screen. If he was already making crowds go wild with his music and live performances, what would happen if he starred in major films? Well, that's exactly what the big Hollywood studios thought. Elvis was a phenomenon, and the cinema saw in him an opportunity to take his image to an even larger audience. The first step was taken in 1956, when Elvis debuted in the film Love Me Tender. In the film, he played a young man from the countryside who gets involved in a family drama during the American Civil War. Even though it was a secondary role, his presence on the screen was so strong that he completely stole the show. The movie theaters were packed. Fans cried, screamed, and when Elvis appeared, people applauded and even got up from their seats. The Hollywood studios realized right away they had a gold mine on their hands. After the success of Love Me Tender, other films came out such as Loving You, 1957, Jailhouse Rock, 1957, and King Creole, 1958. And it was during this period that Elvis began to create a new type of cinema, the musical film starring a rock star. His films were light, fun, and always had lots of music, romance, and scenes that highlighted his charisma. And the most impressive thing? Each film released became an instant success. Fans lined up in huge lines to get a ticket, and the soundtrack albums sold millions. But not everything was perfect. As the years went by, Elvis began to feel that he was being trapped in a single type of role. Producer Colonel Tom Parker, who was also his manager, strictly controlled his career and wanted Elvis to make commercial films, without too many risks, just to make money. Elvis wanted to really act, he wanted challenging roles, but Parker wouldn't let him. The result? He made more than 30 films throughout the 1960s, but many of them had weak scripts and served only as a backdrop for his songs. Despite this, the audience continued to fill the theaters. After all, seeing Elvis Presley on the screen was always an event. Even in the less acclaimed films, his charisma, his smile, and his presence continued to captivate people. But something began to bother Elvis. He felt he was losing his musical essence. He wanted to return to the stage, to feel the energy of the crowds again, to feel the power of rock and roll flowing through his veins. And that's exactly what he would do a few years later in a way that no one expected. Now imagine an artist who conquered music, dominated cinema, but still felt that something was missing. What would you do in Elvis's place? Stay close, because the next phase of the King of Rock's life will surprise you. Military service and a career break. Now imagine this. Elvis Presley was at the height of his success. He was dominating the radio, selling out concerts, starring in blockbuster movies, and was the biggest young star in America. Nothing seemed to be able to stop him. But then in 1958 came a shock. Elvis was drafted into the United States Army. At the time, all American men were required to serve in the military, and not even the biggest rock star could escape it. For fans, it was like a nightmare. What would the world be like without new Elvis music in movies? His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, tried to stop the draft, but in the end, Elvis decided to serve like any other young man. He knew it might affect his career, but he wanted to show that he was no different from anyone else. On March 24, 1958, Elvis reported for duty and was sent to a training center in Texas. Photographers were everywhere. Millions of fans cried when they saw the images of the King of Rock having his famous hair cut short for military service. It was the end of the iconic quiff, at least for a while. After a few weeks of training, Elvis was sent to Friedberg in West Germany, where he would spend almost 2 years serving in the army. It was a difficult period. Away from the stage, away from his fans, away from the mother he loved so much. And it was precisely during this period that a tragedy happened. On August 14, 1958, Gladys Presley, his mother and greatest companion, died suddenly due to liver problems. For Elvis, this was a devastating blow. He had always been very close to his mother, and her death left him completely devastated. But even with a broken heart, he continued to carry out his military obligations. In Germany, Elvis led a normal soldier's routine, but of course he was still a star. Whenever he could, he took pictures with his colleagues, signed autographs, and in his free time he played the guitar and sang for his friends. In March 1960, Elvis finally left the army and returned home. But now he was no longer just a rebellious young rock star. He was a man who had matured, who had faced losses, and who was ready for a new chapter in his life. The big question was, could he still reclaim his throne in the music world? The answer to that came quickly. And believe me, Elvis's comeback was much greater than anyone could have imagined. Love and marriage with Priscilla. Now imagine this. Elvis Presley, the most famous man in the world, returning from military service and resuming his career with full force. But there was something else besides music that occupied his thoughts. Love. While in Germany, while serving in the army, Elvis met a young girl named Priscilla Beaulieu, who was only 14 years old. She was the daughter of a U.S. Air Force officer and lived with her family on the military base. When they first met, something special happened. Priscilla was enchanted by Elvis, but who wouldn't be? He was charming, kind, and already an international star. On the other hand, Elvis was also enchanted by this sweet young woman, with bright blue eyes and a shy smile. At first, Priscilla's parents didn't like the idea at all. How could such a young girl date a world star? But Elvis gradually gained their trust, showing that his intentions were serious. When Elvis returned to the United States in 1960, he and Priscilla were separated for years, but they never stopped communicating. Letters, phone calls, and a few visits kept the relationship alive. She was the only woman who could calm the King of Rock's restless heart. Finally, in 1963, when Priscilla turned 18, she moved to Graceland, Elvis's mansion in Memphis. It was a big change for her, leaving her parents' home to live with one of the biggest idols on the planet. But Elvis took care of her and made sure everything was done in the best possible way. And then, after almost a decade of dating, the moment arrived. On May 1, 1967, Elvis and Priscilla got married in an intimate and glamorous ceremony at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. The press was in an uproar. The most famous couple in the world had finally made their union official. The wedding was a luxurious affair. Priscilla wore a beautiful white dress and Elvis, always stylish, wore an impeccable black suit. After the ceremony, the couple embarked on a honeymoon trip to California. It was like a fairy tale. And then the following year came the greatest gift, the birth of Lisa Marie Presley on February 1, 1968. Elvis was overjoyed. He had always wanted to be a father, and Lisa Marie became the center of his universe. Now what would happen next? The King of Rock was about to make a historic comeback, one of the most iconic moments of his career. The TV special and the triumphant return. Now imagine this. It was 1968 and the music world was no longer the same. The Beatles dominated the charts, the Rolling Stones were on the rise, and rock and roll had evolved. But where was Elvis Presley in this new era? The truth was that in recent years, Elvis had stepped away from the stage. Since leaving the army, he had focused more on his film career, filming one movie after another. And although his films were successful, his music was falling behind. Times had changed, rock was different, and new generations were beginning to see Elvis as a performer of the past. But the King of Rock was not ready to be forgotten. That's when an idea came to mind. A TV special that would mark his grand return. NBC offered Elvis a special end-of-year program. The initial idea was something simple, just him singing some Christmas songs. But Elvis wanted more. He wanted to show the world that he was still the king. That's how the legendary '68 comeback special was born, the program that would bring Elvis back to the top. On December 3, 1968, millions of people turned on their TVs to watch. What they saw that night changed the history of music. Elvis appeared dressed from head to toe in black leather, sitting on a small stage surrounded by musicians and an intimate audience. No special effects, no Hollywood tricks, just him, his band, and his powerful voice. When he started singing Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, and Jailhouse Rock, the audience went wild. He was back. But it wasn't just a nostalgic show. Elvis was different. More mature, more intense. He sang with soul, with passion, with a fire in his eyes that showed the world that he was still the greatest living artist. And the most emotional moment came when he sang If I Can Dream, a song with a powerful message about hope and change. It was one of the most iconic moments in American television. The result? An absolute success. The TV special was a ratings hit, and Elvis proved that he was still relevant, that he still had the voice, presence, and charisma that made him a legend. The show marked the beginning of a new phase in his career. He decided to put films aside and return to what he really loved: live music. Shortly thereafter, he signed a multi-million-dollar contract for a series of shows in Las Vegas, beginning one of the most iconic phases of his life: the glory years in Las Vegas. Now picture this: Las Vegas, Nevada, a city full of bright lights, luxurious casinos, and grandiose shows. At the center of it all, one name shines brighter than any other: Elvis Presley. After the resounding success of the '68 comeback special, Elvis was determined to revive his music career. He wanted to get back on stage, feel the energy of the audience, and show the world that he was still the king of rock. So in 1969, he signed a contract with the legendary International Hotel in Las Vegas for a series of shows. No one knew what to expect. Could Elvis still wow the crowds like he used to? The answer came on the first night of the show. When Elvis took the stage, something magical happened. Wearing a completely new costume, a shiny white jumpsuit with a high collar and sparkling rhinestones, he grabbed the microphone, looked out at the audience, and gave it his all. The audience went wild. Elvis's voice was stronger than ever. His charisma set the stage on fire. He sang classics like Suspicious Minds, In the Ghetto, and Can't Help Falling in Love, and gave performances so intense that people could hardly believe what they were seeing. It was a true rebirth. The first show and all the following shows sold out. The success was so great that Elvis decided to make Las Vegas his new musical home. Over the next few years, he performed almost every night, always to packed houses, always drawing applause and hysterical screams from the audience. He was no longer just a singer. He was a spectacle. The Las Vegas shows gave Elvis a new identity. He created a new visual style: the famous beaded jumpsuits, the long capes, the sunglasses, and the shiny rings. He now had a full band, an orchestra, and a powerful choir. Everything was grand, everything was iconic. But there was a difficult side to all this. The Vegas routine was exhausting. He performed shows every night, barely had time to rest, and the pressure of maintaining a flawless performance was enormous. To keep up with this pace, Elvis began to depend on medication, something that, unfortunately, would become a serious problem in the following years. Even so, he continued to shine. Each performance was unique, each show was an unforgettable spectacle. He had reinvented his career and proved once again that his talent was eternal. Now tell me, how many artists can reinvent themselves in this way and still fill arenas night after night? This only proves one thing: Elvis Presley was not just a singer, he was a true phenomenon. But despite all the happiness, not everything was perfect. Elvis and Priscilla's marriage began to face challenges. Elvis's schedule was busy, and he spent a lot of time away from home. In addition, his fame and the harassment from fans made everything more complicated. Over time, the relationship began to wear thin. Priscilla wanted more attention, and Elvis seemed increasingly distant. Although they still loved each other, they realized that they were living very different lives. Finally, in 1973, after 6 years of marriage, Elvis and Priscilla divorced. It was a difficult time, but the two decided to maintain a good relationship, mainly because of Lisa Marie. Even though they were separated, Priscilla always had great respect and affection for Elvis. This was one of the most exciting chapters in the life of the King of Rock. He found love, built a family, but also faced the difficulties of being a global icon. Stay with me because the last years of the King's life were as intense as his rise. Health problems and medication use. Now imagine this. Elvis Presley was still the biggest star on the planet. His shows in Las Vegas were an absolute success. He continued to sell out arenas and sell millions of records. But behind the glare of the spotlight, the reality was much darker. The grueling schedule of almost daily shows, travel commitments, and the pressure of maintaining his status as a global icon began to take a toll. Elvis had no time to rest and his health began to deteriorate. And that's when a problem arose that would change his life forever. Prescription drugs. To deal with physical pain, exhaustion, and insomnia, Elvis began taking prescription drugs. At first, it seemed harmless, just a way to help him cope with fatigue and maintain his performance on stage. But over time, he began to rely more and more on these substances. Signs of the problem began to appear. In the early 1970s, Elvis began to gain weight rapidly. His face, once sculpted and youthful, now looked puffy. His energy began to wane. Some nights he still gave great shows, but on others he seemed tired, lost, and disconnected. The audience noticed the change. There were days when Elvis could barely sing as powerfully as before. Some shows ended abruptly, and sometimes he forgot the lyrics to songs he had been singing for years. The saddest part? He couldn't stop. Elvis felt trapped by his own fame. He loved his fans, he loved singing, but he was also exhausted. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, wouldn't give him a break. Even when Elvis wanted to stop, Tom Parker would push him to keep going. The vicious cycle of medication intensified. He took sleeping pills, then pills to wake up, then pills to cope with the pain. And the more he took, the worse his health got. In addition, his divorce from Priscilla in 1973 shook him deeply. She was the great love of his life, but they were already living in separate worlds. The divorce made him sink even deeper into loneliness and excess. Elvis's friends tried to help him, but no one could really pull him out of this path. He didn't trust conventional doctors, only those who prescribed what he wanted. And so, the King of Rock spent the last years of his life fighting against himself. But even with all these problems, Elvis still refused to give up. He kept performing, kept enchanting crowds. Because deep down the stage was all he knew. Now tell me, how many idols have been trapped in the same trap of fame? Pressure, loneliness, and addictions are invisible enemies that have destroyed many legends. And unfortunately, Elvis was getting closer and closer to this fate. But what happened in the King's last days? Get ready because we are approaching the saddest and most unforgettable moment in his history. The premature death. Now imagine this. It's 1977 and the world still sees Elvis Presley as the King of Rock. But behind the scenes he was no longer the same. The man who once set the stage on fire with his energy was now struggling with his own body and his fragile health. Elvis was visibly different. He had gained a lot of weight, his voice no longer had the same power as before, and he seemed tired all the time. But despite everything, he kept performing. Because deep down he knew that his fans were still waiting for him. And Elvis never wanted to disappoint them. His last show took place on June 26, 1977, in the city of Indianapolis. On stage, despite his weakness, Elvis gave everything he could. He sang Unchained Melody sitting at the piano, and his voice, even weakened, still moved the audience. No one knew, but that would be his last performance. Less than 2 months later, on the morning of August 16, 1977, Elvis was found unconscious in the bathroom of his mansion, Graceland, in Memphis. He was only 42 years old. Doctors tried to revive him, but there was nothing they could do. The world was in shock. The King of Rock and Roll was gone. The news spread quickly. Fans around the world wept. Thousands of people gathered in front of Graceland to pay their respects to their idol. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but doctors also pointed out that excessive use of medication contributed to his poor health. It was hard to believe. Elvis Presley, the greatest music star, the man who revolutionized rock, was gone so soon. But do you know what's most impressive? Elvis never really went away. Even after his death, his legacy continued to grow. His name, his music, and his influence never faded. Now tell me, how can an artist be so great that his legend never dies? The answer is simple. Elvis was not just a singer. He was an icon, a revolution, a phenomenon that transformed culture forever. And even today, decades later, his impact can still be felt in every chord of rock and roll, in every artist who was inspired by him, in every fan who still sings his songs. The king may be gone, but his reign is eternal. The eternal legacy of the King of Rock. Now tell me, how can someone be gone and still remain so present? That is the true magic of Elvis Presley. Decades after his death, Elvis lives on. His music is still being heard, his films are still being watched, and his impact on pop culture has never faded. Graceland, the house where he lived and died, has become a sanctuary for millions of fans from all over the world. People travel from all corners of the planet to visit the place where the King of Rock and Roll lived out his days. Artists like the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Bruce Springsteen, and many other music icons have already stated that they were inspired by Elvis. Without him, rock as we know it today might not even exist. His hits like Can't Help Falling in Love, Suspicious Minds, Jailhouse Rock, and Love Me Tender continue to thrill new generations. Elvis has transcended time. He has become immortal through his art. So the truth is that Elvis Presley never died. He is in every fan who sings his songs, in every young person who discovers his story and is enchanted by his voice. The King of Rock is not just a memory, he is a living legacy. And now I want to know from you, what is your favorite Elvis song? What moment in your life did he mark? Comment below because I want to know your opinion. And if you enjoyed this incredible story and want to see more biographies like this, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The king may be gone, but his music and legend will live on forever. Until next time.